Welcome to week 5. We'll be discussing the Bauhaus and the new typography that resulted from it. You know, art majors have really not changed all that much. We still have kooky, wacky, fun parties with costumes. We still take arty selfies and have cool haircuts. We still sport trendy clothes and haircuts, like these shockingly short skirts and short hair in 1923. It's possible that overly dramatic posing still happens. And all of that may have originated back at the original art school, the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was the best-known school of art, design, and architecture of the 20th century. Of course, not when it started. It was officially called the Staatliches Bauhaus, I think is how you might pronounce it in German. It was a German art and architecture school that was founded in 1919 and operated through 1933. The name of the school loosely translates to architecture house or building house. The word Bauhaus is now shorthand for an architectural and graphic style. It's also the name of a typeface and a band and a synonym for modernism in general. If you look at German architecture before and after the Bauhaus, I think that you can appreciate the shocking changes that resulted as the students from this style, the students and professors who worked in this style, began to build. Similarly, check out the chairs. Remember, Art Nouveau was only in 1900, and by 1923, we had evolved to the famous Mies chair, Mies van der Rohe, architect and designer from the Bauhaus. It's important to realize how many of the iconic designs of the Bauhaus are still around, especially in high-end advertising agencies and design studios. The Bauhaus movement really is divided into 3 parts. There was the Weimar period from 1919 to 1925 with the school head Walter Gropius, the Dessau period from 1925 to 1932 with Hans Meyer, and the Berlin period, very short-lived, with Ludwig Mies van der Rohe at the helm. When one thinks of Bauhaus, one usually thinks of strong, powerful, machine-like structures and architecture, and not necessarily graphic design. I think part of that is the skewed view of architects as male and some of the other arts and crafts that were taught at the Bauhaus as being primarily female. A number of visionary faculty members, again, perhaps skewing a little to the male side: Herbert Matter, Paul Klee, Johann Itten, Laszlo, moholy-nagy, Vasily Kandinsky, and Lionel Fenninger. At the Bauhaus, students learned stained glass, wood, and metal workshops that were taught by both an artist and a craftsman, which was a novel concept. And at first, at least, the school was organized along medieval guild lines in terms of you began as an apprentice and then proceeded to become a journeyman and then became a master. Although many of the teachers were not architects, the school's aim was that all students should graduate in architecture because it was believed that architecture encapsulated all other areas of art and design. So often when we're talking about Bauhaus, we're talking about architecture. The Bauhaus in Weimar. The Weimar Republic was the form of government in Germany that preceded the Nazi party's rise to power. That's what we're talking about, and it's also a town, Weimar. So this is the building in Weimar from 1919 to 1925. Just of note are the large windows. This is like a typical design for some kind of factory structure back then because you needed a lot of daylight in big classrooms like that, and that's why they had skylights also. It was easier and cheaper to light with daylight than to light with electrical light. You can see their original logo has more of a medieval or craft feel. This was the seal. You can see at the top across Stadt X Bauhaus Weimar. And got perhaps a little bit of a swastika in there, but these are all ancient symbols from different medieval guilds combined into one, and there's kind of a little guy in the middle holding up a pyramid. Walter Gropius was the director of the Bauhaus, who sought to unite art and technology. The whole idea, much like the William Morris arts and crafts idea, was to be able to start thinking about art in a world where we had means of industrial production, not only in things like chairs and lamps and ceramics, but even in the elements of building trades. So, wrought iron buildings, large masses of glass. These were new forms of industrial pieces that could become architecture. And they had this idea that they could solve some of the problems that were created by industrialism by making a higher grade of manufactured objects. So by combining architecture, crafts, and an art school, the idea was to lift the elements of craft into a more aesthetically pleasing and theoretically based forms. The Bauhaus style represented a more functional, inexpensive, and mass-produced sensibility. Gropius wrote a manifesto for the movement when he founded the school in 1919. It was not like the angrier manifestos associated with Dada and Futurism. It cited positive messages of utopian ideals. In the manifesto, he advocates the significance of architecture as the epitome of design. Some people do call architecture the mother of the arts. And if you think about 1919, that's a significant year at the end of the First World War. So remember that Germany lay dismantled in pieces. The Bauhaus instructors, especially Johann Itten, who is, I think, my favorite Bauhaus teacher, believe that play creates solidarity and creativity. So not only did they have awesome costume parties, but they put on a lot of performance events. These are some recreated costumes that were designed by Oskar Schlemmer in later years. And you can see this sort of art principles taking place in the designs there of basic shapes like spheres and circles and triangles and squares, and basic colors. Costume parties and theatrical performances were an essential part of the education at the Bauhaus, but these more ephemeral artworks, along with many of the contributions of the female students in the textile and ceramic schools, have not historically been as centered in studies of the Bauhaus as those of the architecture and product design, which were considered the proper realms of male students and more serious in purpose. So some of these images are just now becoming uncovered and studied. In the Bauhaus, we call this style a style of anything geometric, functional, or modern. It's sort of become shorthand for modernism. But there in the Bauhaus Manifesto, objects were to be designed for functionality rather than adherence to any one visual style. So there was a process of streamlining, and the idea that form follows function is an important lesson from the Bauhaus. The essential features of design there were order, asymmetry, and a basic rectangular grid structure, which, of course, the Bauhaus teachers were well aware of what was going on, evolving at the time in both Russia and the Netherlands in terms of constructivism, suprematism, and de Stijl, and borrowed heavily from those ideas, especially a lot of dialogue back and forth with the theorists and teachers of de Stijl. Decoration was limited to the use of heavy rules, circles, and triangles, and rectangles in graphic design. And photography and montage in design replaced realistic drawing as illustration. Of course, we think of it also as the sans serif typeface, regarded as essential. The foundation course of the Bauhaus, I apologize for the low resolution of this image. This is Johann Itten, was established by Johann Itten. And if you took a class called Foundations of Design or 3D Foundations, all of your foundation art classes are still derived from this basic foundation class. Behind him, you can see a hand-painted version of the color wheel. All of the Bauhaus teachers began by teaching color and form. The goals of the foundation course, everybody started all together, again, whether you were studying architecture or textile design or painting or graphic design, everyone was in the same foundations course, which also might sound familiar to you. The goals of the course were to release your creative abilities. So there was actually I wish we had better film of these exercises, but they did do things like physical play and calisthenics and performance kind of art. And students were also expected to develop an understanding of the physical nature of materials. There was a lot of hand skills, from working with the same kinds of color aid papers that you're going to use in this week's activity, to working with mud and clay and bricks and wood, both two-dimensional and three-dimensional design, to teach the fundamental principles of design underlying all visual art. And again, there was no distinction between fine and applied art. By 1923, when the school launched their first major exhibition, we'll look at the promotional pieces for that, the Bauhaus was evolving away from this kind of medieval concerns of craftsmanship a little bit and handicraft towards an emphasis on rationalism and, again, design for machine-produced objects. Johann Itten also belonged to kind of an esoteric religious group, which I think might explain his odd robe, or maybe that's just like his academic robe. These are some examples of works from the foundation course, which might look familiar to you. He made it was the Mazdaznan cult is what he believed in. And I had the chance to see some of these kinds of original student materials that are in the archive at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles when the Bauhaus teachers eventually fled Nazi Germany. They happened to, it just is so emotional to me, they carried away with them, must have been their student projects, like their best student examples, which were, done with gouache or watercolor paint on pieces of Bristol board. They still look just like the day that someone drew them, and they're on file at the Getty Museum from the collections of people like Joseph Albers and Walter Gropius. Just Schmidt eventually became one of the masters of the Bauhaus, ran the organization, I believe, when it was in the Berlin phase. This shows the influence of Oskar Schlemmer, who was then one of the masters at the Bauhaus, and again, combining geometric and machine forms. The little circle in the middle of the shape at the upper left is a profile of a person, and that became their logo. This is from the Bauhaus exhibition of 1923, so the first exhibition of the work of the students and masters in the Weimar. And you can see here that there are echoes of Cubism, Constructivism, and De Stijl, and some evidence that the Bauhaus was working, the teachers were working on uniting all of these diverse movements into a cohesive theory of design. This is the title page from the catalog for that show, designed by Laszlo moholy-nagy. And you can see that this page structure is based on a series of right angles, and that stripes applied to the two words kind of do that hierarchical job of sending things into a different plane. Moholy-nagy described typography as a tool of communication and advocated uninhibited use of all linear directions, not only horizontal. So some new ideas here that have become common and everyday to us, but radically new at the time. This is the cover. That was the title page of the catalog. This is the cover of it for the Bauhaus exhibition in 1923. We've got these geometrically constructed letter forms printed in red and blue on black and tightly compressed into a square. The worship of the square, I think, is kind of a hallmark of the Bauhaus. Herbert Bayer, another one of the instructors there. At this time, I just threw this in here because you can see that early in the Bauhaus years, the school and the government were closely aligned. So Herbert Bayer was commissioned to design this 2 million? Hang on. How many? Yeah, 20 million mark note. And it's a little bit emotional because this was at a time of ridiculous inflation. So 20 million marks would be like $20 million, I guess, here. And just shows how they had to keep redesigning the currency because the value of the currency was deflating so fast. And there were widespread famine and, just chaotic unrest during this period of hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic. Paper money was so worthless, it was more economical to use it as fuel than to use it for trade. It became there's images of people rolling around wheelbarrows full of cash to try to buy like a loaf of bread. This is another piece by Herbert Bayer, well preserved, a drawing of a proposed combined streetcar station and newsstand. It was a small modular unit, again designed for economical mass production. They didn't just copy the De Stijl and constructivist movements, but developed formal principles that could be applied to many areas of life, not just, Mondrian's primary colored paintings, but thinking about practical application of those kinds of theories into community life. So as the Bauhaus grew and needed more space, they moved to Dessau into a purpose-built government. There were also tensions between the school and the local Weimar government that forced them to move. The curriculum was reorganized. The idea of the master journeyman apprentice system was abandoned, and masters began to be called professors. So really moving from that medieval system into a more contemporary system that we still use today. It was renamed the High School for Form in 1926. And you can see what a change in the logo from that medieval guild version to this very De Stijl looking geometric form with even geometric type designed in a circle around it. And a spectacular new building designed by Walter Gropius. This is the wood shop shown here, but it also included classrooms, dorms, and administrative structures. It was a unified whole. The campus was designed as a unified whole. And it's nice that we recently passed the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Bauhaus in 2019, and there's continuing ongoing celebrations probably for the next 10 years in the 100th anniversaries. They created, when they moved to Dessau, the Bauhaus Corporation, which was a business organization designed to handle the sales of workshop prototypes for industry and to coordinate industrial sponsorship. They began to produce steel furniture, functional architecture, environmental designs, and typography, all pushed to a higher degree of importance. In Dessau, Joseph Albers, Marcel Breuer, the Breuer Chair, and Herbert Bayer joined the faculty and became professors in the newly formed Typography and Graphic Design Workshop. And the new design workshop made important typographic innovations along functional and constructivist lines, again in dialogue with artists working in Russia and in the Netherlands. This is Herbert Bayer's symbol for the Krauss Stained Glass Workshop in 1923. What other movement does this remind you of? And yes, he was aware of his friend Pierre Mondrian. This is the influence of the gestile movement, a square divided by a horizontal line into two rectangles, and then each rectangle divided with a vertical to form a square. It's based on the golden means, the way that nature replicates this kind of square and a half mathematical form. Poster by Just Schmidt in 1926, celebrating this new technology, an offset press. Offset presses work with giant rolls of paper zipping through big machines. So that's what that reference image is at the top. This is a new journal and to investigate a new technology. And Laszlo moholy-nagy, that's how you pronounce that, by the way. It's not moholy-nagy or Nagy. It's Laszlo moholy-nagy. These are 4 different dust jackets for 4 different Bauhaus books over the years from 1924 to 1923. I love the one on the bottom right that looks like some kind of a clear plexiglass. What I read it as is a clear plexiglass stand for holding up a piece of paper and casting a shadow, but actually it's a flat design. That whole rectangle is like an image design. I don't know if he used probably partially photo montage. The jacket for book number 12 on the lower left was printed on tracing paper. And oh yes, for number 14, it was a photograph of type that was printed on glass and then projected. You can see in volumes 5 and 10 the close contacts with the gestile movement, and then 12 and 14 moving into a more three-dimensional space, reflecting the emphasis on architecture at the school. If you Google Bauhaus, one of the first things that you're going to find are variations of this typeface. This was designed by Herbert Bayer in 1925. Also a very radical idea. It was an experiment, kind of a typographic thought experiment of reducing the alphabet to one set of clear, simple geometrical forms. After all, why use a uppercase and a lowercase if you could have one alphabet that would do both jobs? So for example, in this design by Herbert Bayer celebrating the birthday of Vasily Kandinsky, you can see that there's basically one typeface and one, it's even in mostly all capital letters except for that little graph shape in the lower right. But by varying just the color, the weight, the spacing of the letters, and their position, a hierarchy is established of, 10 or, 11 different layers. Here's another one I like to think of as my darlings. I don't know what kind of a person he was, but Laszlo moholy-nagy. He replaced Johann Itten as the director of the foundation course in 1923 and influenced instruction and philosophy greatly. He also ended up in the United States eventually. And he coined the term typophoto, the union of word and image together to communicate a message with immediacy. He had a passion for typography and photography, so those two things blended together, typophoto, and really interesting three-dimensional and light effects with typography that no one else was doing. The impact of Laszlo moholy-nagy on the school, he used techniques such as an enlargement, distortion, dropouts, double exposures, and montage in graphic design. Again, he was interested in photomontage, the technique of manipulating and merging photographic images mostly in the darkroom or inside the camera, and photograms that allow the artist to capture a pattern of light or dark on a sheet of photographic paper without a camera. In their minds, that this was pure photography because there wasn't even a camera. It's just an object in a piece of photographic film. If you take black and white darkroom photography, of course, you undoubtedly will get to play with photograms. It's very fun. And you can starting to look at objects, thinking about their light modulating properties as opposed to their color or tone is interesting. Here's another piece, probably done with cutout pieces of paper or the burn and dodge tool you might have used in a darkroom class. Here's that wonderful double exposure of maybe just his face leaning over the darkroom paper. This is an example of a sketch for a title page for the magazine Broom from 1923. We looked at some Distiel submissions to the magazine. This was a progressive design for this avant-garde magazine showcasing his understanding of cubism. And again, I think you can see that sort of optical effect idea of typography on a piece of glass. Here's a wonderful poster that he designed in 1923 for pneumatic tires. In this case, the typography was not projected on film, but drawn by hand and integrated with a photograph of the little race car into an immediate and unified communication. He was, of course, also an accomplished traditional photographer using a camera and lens. And I love this combination of two photographs that he just butted up next to each other. To me, I look at this and I can't help but see a double-page spread in a magazine. This was called The World Foundation and produced in 1927. These he called photoplastics, which were more creative and more functional than regular photography. So again, they were a combination of cut and printed photographs with some drawn elements, really a collage or, again, photo montage. So he was able to, select bits and pieces of photographs and force them into Bauhaus grid-like structures. And they're quite conceptual and fun. I love this one. This was accompanied by the description, quack-clacking super geese, observing the simplicity of the world constructed as a leg show. Pelicans and legs and some kind of little lemur up at the top. Love it. Another composition by moholy-nagy. These are often, I think, humorous and visionary and moving and insightful. Again, he used drawn additions here, like the little lines, complex associations that he seemed to find in visual objects and unexpected juxtapositions. Again, I apologize for the roughness of these visuals. They're super old. And then sadly, the Bauhaus kind of got further expelled from their Dessau location, moved to Berlin to try to be safe. In the third phase, 1928, Herbert Bayer and Laszlo moholy-nagy moved to Berlin, and Just Schmidt became the master of typography and graphic design workshop and helped to further exhibition design. This was short-lived, again from 1928 to 1933. And sadly, on August 10th in 1933, the Nazi stormtroopers invaded the school and rounded up the students for interrogation, forcing it to close. The Nazi Party had opposed the school all the way through the 1920s. We talked about Hitler's fondness for German fractal type as opposed to the modern sans serifs. But the Nazi Party didn't have enough power to shut it down until the 1930s. And it's kind of a terrifying presaging of what happened next. Hitler considered the Bauhaus style un-German and a front for communists, in part because there were many Russian artists attending this school. There was no equivalent school in Russia. And even the flat roofs of the modernists were perceived by the Nazis as being unsuited to northern climes and therefore Jewish. On the upside, many of the Bauhaus teachers and students emigrated to other countries fairly quickly after, and so were saved from the Holocaust by exiting in 1933. The emigres from the Bauhaus settled all over the world. More than 300 modernist architects settled in the United Kingdom, including Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, Bertold Lübken, and Erich Mendelsohn. Many, but not all of them, were Jewish refugees. Some re-emigrated to the United States or moved directly to other places, including Tel Aviv, after the war. This is a piece from the period of the Bauhaus in Berlin by moholy-nagy. It's a brochure cover for a series of 14 Bauhaus books in 1929. And if you can see here, it was, again, a photo montage with the words Bauhaus Bookes set in metal type and then flipped. So it reads upside down and right side up. And it's in the right reading mode, which, of course, if it was actual metal type, it would have been reversed, if that makes sense to you. These 14 books became important vehicles for disseminating the advanced and complete Bauhaus ideas and theories. They also had the Bauhaus magazine, which disseminated the ideas about the Bauhaus theory all around the world to architects and designers. Kandinsky, Paul Klee, Gropius, Mondrian, moholy-nagy, and Theo van Doesburg from the De Stijl movement were the editors and authors of various volumes in the magazine series. So a lot of big names. And just to highlight the women of the Bauhaus who have recently received more attention, interestingly, unlike other art schools in Germany and probably in most of the other places in the world, Bauhaus classes were not segregated. The majority of the female students, however, went into, or sort of shuttled, no pun intended, actually pun intended, into the weaving workshop, which was run by women, and also tolerated in the ceramics and metal jewelry workshops. In the beginning, about a quarter of the students were women, but it's interesting to me that by 1929, 30% of them were women, and 19 of them were in the weaving workshop. Walter Gropius had a system of appointing students as teachers. Many of these female students emigrated to the United States, where they influenced the course of American design and design education, both in textiles and ceramics and photography and other areas. The Bauhaus, all the way throughout, it was important to note, that was a commercial enterprise. So ever since they opened the building in Dessau, they had products for sale or also licensed their designs to manufacturers. And of course, probably the most famous of those are various buildings that were built by architects around the world. But it's important to note how profitable both the textile and the ceramics department were in making commercial products for sale. So the Gunther Stoltz, who is one of the artists, says, nearly all of us came from academies or schools of applied art, and we wanted to be rid of the dry exercises in drawing and painting. We wanted to make living things with contemporary relevance. And also, the idea of making money, of being able to design elements that were used in people's homes that could be for sale. We would call it product design now. At Dessau, production from these workshops became an important source of income, and they set up the Bauhaus GmbH company. That's sort of like the German equivalent of Incorporated, was set up to market designs and products. Wonderful textile designs. A lot of these were done with gouache or watercolor on paper, and then you can see the resulting execution in textiles. Sometimes the textiles were sold off and aren't necessarily available, but a lot of the designs remain. And you can really see the designer's thought process when you look at these early exercises and drawings. I love this photograph. This is a designer, Ati Berger, who was sitting on top of her high loom. And again, she's wearing extremely advanced pair of overalls, which look very punk rock to me. This is from probably 1930. She eventually emigrated and came to the United Kingdom. And you had to sit at a loom like that to be able to make these really large, long rug pieces. This is a different artist, Gunther Stoltz. In 1920, very early on in the Bauhaus, a women's class was founded in the summer, and this coincided with a crisis in Gunther's personal life when she ended her engagement to a painter. So Walter Gropius asked her to head up the newly founded summer class, and she wove her first small piece there on the left called Cows in Landscape during the summer recess. Love that. You can see that drawing on the right is done on grid paper in watercolor as she's planning her design for a textile piece. In the world of ceramics, we have Margaret Hayman, who established a business called the Hale Werkstätten Pottery to produce her designs. They were composed of simple shapes, mostly circles and triangles, look really strikingly modern. And she colored them with vivid glazes, typically yellows and blues, and often added patterns in the constructivist style of Kandinsky's paintings. Within a few years, this is fairly amazing to me, the factory employed 120 people, and she was exporting her designs to fashionable stores in the United States and in Britain. In 1928, one of the owners of the factory and her husband, Mr. Lobenstein, was killed in a car crash, leaving her a widow with 2 sons. She ran the factory on her own, but struggled throughout the 1930s with the growing economic depression and Nazi oppression. And in 1935, she was forced to sell it for a tiny pittance and fled with the help of the London department store owner, who was one of her clients, to leave Germany for Britain with her sons. Working in metals, you can see the connection, I think, between all of these mediums and how the Bauhaus principles of geometric shapes and simplicity in design and form are connected, whether it's through textiles, ceramics, or metals. This was a teapot and ashtray and a hanging light by the artist Marianne Brandt. She became the temporary head of the metal workshop in 1929, again showing that the Bauhaus masters entrusted these positions of teaching positions to women as well as men, which was, again, 1928. In many countries, for example, at Oxford in the United Kingdom, women were still not allowed to take classes in 1928. Crazy. She left the Bauhaus in 1929 to work with Walter Gropius's architectural office in Berlin, undoubtedly producing elements like this for installation in his houses, and then became a designer for the company Ruppelwerk, a metalware manufacturer in the city of Gotha from 1928 to 1932. Another chick that I admire is Lucia Moholy-nagy, or Moholy, I guess, and she was one of the most prolific photographers at the Bauhaus between 1923 and 1928. Thank goodness she documented many of the students and professors. A lot of the portraits and the in-class materials that we have remaining are because of her. Her husband was Laszlo moholy-nagy and was an instructor there. For her, photography was not simply a transparent window onto an objective reality, but a specific technology to be used as and explored in the modern spirit of new manufactured mediums. She was not only a photographer, but a creative partner with moholy-nagy. Some of her work is the credits of her work are lost. It's unclear which objects she collaborated on and which she didn't, but she lost access to many of her negatives and prints from the early pre-war period during the war, who were then misattributed to other artists, and she had to battle to regain rights to her own work for her own estate after the war. Okay, let's take a look at the world of the new typography, the most hip, slick, cool, happening, trendy works of graphic design. Many innovations in design occurred outside of mainstream society. So this was not, the Sunday newspaper where any of this experimentation was going on. The new typography we can define as a rejection of the classical rules of typographic symmetry. The movement was inspired by a general degradation of typography. So as industrial printing became more widespread, the craft and art of those, fine art book presses and small publishers was starting to get lost, and things were getting sloppy and cheap, basically. This movement was also a response to new printing technologies that allowed designers to break free from the confines of traditional type, especially that horizontal orientation. And this guy right here was the master of this new work. Of course, this is a picture of him as he was older in 1965. So he was kind of the master emeritus. When he was making the stuff up, he was in his young 20s. He was a trained calligrapher and typographer. And I think it's just kind of wonderful that before the first Bauhaus exhibition, remember that was in 1923, he was working in classic styles like this. You can see his background in calligraphy. This was a poster for a graphic art exhibition in 1919. You've got symmetry, right-centered type, left and right, and historical letter forms that characterize his youthful work. And keep in mind that he is about the age of whatever year it is. So in 1919, I think he was a little bit older than 19. But then he went to this show in 1923. The light dawned in his eyes, and by 1924, he was doing work like this. This is a display poster for a publisher, one of his earliest attempts to apply these modern design principles to his own work, and he became a practitioner and lead innovator in new typographic expression. And one of the main ways that he disseminated these ideas was by this publication. It was really just a small insert, a 24-page book that was designed to be disseminated to printers, typesetters, and designers. Remember, at the time, there was no job description as a graphic designer, likely a person that worked at the local print shop in every little city was designing most of the materials that they were printing. So he wanted to get the rules out to everybody, like, hello, everybody, wake up. There's a new way to do things. This is it. Follow my directions. This is the elementary, introductory principles here in this new type, and I want to explain it to you. Rested in principles of sparse, open functionalism, and this little manifesto, in essence, is his most famous work. It condemns all fonts but the sans serif, condemns centered design, especially on title pages. He was an early advocate of standardized paper sizes. Seems pretty basic, but standardizing paper sizes for all printed matter would also help standardize design. And he makes some of the first clear explanations of the effective use of different sizes and weights of type to quickly and easily convey information. Although the book is a classic, you can get it in a little slim paperback volume. He later abandoned his rigid beliefs and that what he espoused in the book and called it too extreme, but it's understandable. It was early on. It was 1925. He was super excited about it, and he was like, "This is it. This is the system." So inside, we've got a little credit page, and then the opening title page, which is the white right-hand page and the solid black left-hand page. Who does that remind you of? And this is really the Bible. This is the Bible. Just follow these instructions and you can do no wrong. Inside, we have this inside spread that shows how to organize typography along the new lines, various examples, and you can see who he's citing here. The Isms book cover and the Broom magazine cover, constructivists. This is another spread from the elementary typography insert in 1925. And after that work, he also, of course, went on to produce many works of design himself. including this is a cinema poster for a movie called The Hose or The Trousers in 1927. Really reminds me of that Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge constructivist poster, doesn't it? The forms are balancing on a diagonal axis with a round image. Innovative use of a reversed photo negative. It's called The Professional Photographer. This was an exhibition for a show called The Professional Photographer, one of his last works based on the principles of new typography. Wonderful rainbow printing demonstration there in the main title. That would have been done by something called a split fountain, which is not an easy thing to do. Here's an exhibition for a show about constructivism in 1937. Again, black type with this soft shaded circle, giving a sense of perfect balance. And again, just of note, notice how many of these examples are from either exhibitions of design, publications about design, books about design. So if your clients won't let you try the trendy, new, cool, hip, happening thing that you want to do it as a work about your work. And then, whoops, what's going on here? By 1947, he had reverted a little bit back to his classical symmetry, early underpinnings, with a little bit more of that hands-on craftsman feel of calligraphic forms. This, I believe, is the typeface Palatino or something close to it. And he was in part of the revival of Roman inscriptions, back to those classical Roman forms. And again, think about it, okay? Those 1920s and 1930s works pre-World War II, maybe World War II was a little bit of a kick in the pants. And then afterwards, it's like, okay, well, we tried to form this whole new ideal world based on sans serif type, and it didn't quite pay off the way that we expected. So maybe we should open our doors to some of the sort of Enlightenment era typography. So as part of the worldwide spread of these new typographic ideas, the sans serif typefaces were reborn, initially created in 1816, but really didn't come into style until the 1920s. And sans serif, of course, played into the less is more philosophy of the Bauhaus school, which heavily influenced typographers around the world. Popularity of the sans serif included the fact that you could make many weights of it, especially in photographic reproduction. So from the thin thins to thick thicks to meet all of your typographic needs. And also the letters could easily be expanded or condensed without those pesky serifs bumping into each other. You could make a lot of weights and styles. One of the icons of sans serif type design is Eric Gill, here portrayed also in his artist's smock. He's a little bit controversial. If you love the typeface Gill, you might want to just fast forward through this so that you don't hear anything disheartening. At one point, this is so extreme. At one point, he and his family lived for 11 years in a park in front of a cathedral. He had a large household of family, children, followers, apprentices, and animals. He came from a background as a stone carver, as well as an engraver and type designer. And he combined extreme religiosity with an unusual degree of sexual license. He happened to enjoy sex with his sisters, his wife, his mistresses, his daughters, and his dog, I'm sorry to say. Quite unfortunate. So this, again, brings up the question of, do we appreciate artists and designers for their work if we divorce them from their personal failings? He published several books of woodcuts. So I think there's an interesting progression between, not to abandon that controversial subject matter, but back to the artwork. So progression from stone carving to carving wood and doing woodcuts to carving metal into typefaces. And of course, he's most famous for his typeface, which you probably know, Gill Sans, a sans serif typeface with many different weights that was produced by the Monotype Corporation in 1928 to 1930. He was English, and this typeface was sort of the English entry into sans serif type, as opposed to the Mergenthaler and other German Berthold type foundries. The Monotype foundry is the English foundry. So Eric Gill, an English typographer. Here was a page from his book, The Four Gospels, in 1931. A beautiful, again, if you can sort of divorce your heart from the personal failings and possibly your mind from the subject matter, but this is a page from the Four Gospels with this beautiful work of descending type sizes from 4 different works, from the word and to behold down to the initial caps and now, and then the body text. You've got these unjustified right hand, so flush left, rag right, and initial capitals that were integrated with illustrations and forged into a unified whole. Really an offshoot. You can see the connections to the kind of William Morris Arts and Crafts small press types of page design. Here's just a reprise of his Gill Sans typeface that was extremely useful, still is extremely useful because of the variety of weights and degrees of condensation. It was redesigned to address the needs of new typecasting and printing. Was one of the first designers to use an unequal word spacing instead of a ragged right justification. Type designer Paul Renner, he was interested in the structural relationships in layout that typify the new typography, and is most famously known for the design of the typeface Futura. Here you can see an early experiment with the typeface when he was working on boiling it down to pure forms, including the little circle as the arch in the R. This was a folder for the new typeface in 1927. You can see there he and his fellows hunched over drawings of the typefaces. It was more abstract than the fonts that were released in America. The extensive range of sizes and weights provided lots of options for designer with different versions of contrast for printers again and designers who were working with this new typography. Typefaces from 1927 to 1930. I love this, the crazy left turn there at the bottom, the Futura display and Futura black faces, which are like, you know what, everything's really simple and boiled down, but I'm going to throw in some funk with little triangular legs. It was one of the many geometrically constructed sans serif typefaces designed in the 1920s, but probably the most widely used. Kind of came back around in the 70s and 80s, picked up by a lot of new age designers. Another German fellow, Rudolf Koch, designed the typeface Kabel. This is Kabel Light in 1928. Again, designed on those extreme geometric forms, triangles and circles, half circles. A series of ads introduced his range of weights to German designers and printers. For example, this one. Beautiful combination of the sans serif modernist ideas. Look at that great little E inside of the O, and the und, meaning and, squished into the middle of a sentence, but then kind of reverting back to a little bit more decorative, medieval sort of style border, 1928. In England, back to England again, we have Stanley Morrison, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so shocked. What is this? A serif typeface? Yes. 1927, Stanley Morrison became the typographic advisor to the London Times and redesigned the typeface Times. And you may know it very well. It's pretty much the default typeface in every computer application. And Morrison redesigned it to have shorter ascenders and descenders with small, sharp serifs that were better for printing on rough newsprint. They redesigned the 120-year-old, more calligraphic typeface with this new trendy, stripped-down style of New Roman. And Morrison supervised the design of the whole newspaper, not just the type. As a result of the new typography movement, we have several, again, outside of the mainstream, but very influential artists and designers working in the Netherlands. Designers influenced by both the De Stijl and other modern movements and the new typography. Again, it was the home of De Stijl, which was evolving into new forms. These artists were still very personal in their visions and include P.A. Zwart, H.N. Workman, and William Sandberg. P.A. Zwart, fun, again, arty selfie. His name, Zwart, the word Zwart means black in Dutch. He rejected traditional layout and symmetrical layout in form of the insistence on asymmetrical and horizontals and verticals. He thought of layouts as fields of tension that were brought alive by rhythmic compositions and contrasts of size and weight, and a dynamic interplay of type and background. For example, this ad for the Laga company in 1923. And I think when you look at these old ads, you can see both the exciting possibilities of this new type of style and also some of the limitations. This happens to be an ad for a flooring manufacturer. You could kind of see that maybe I understand those shapes as rectangular pieces of, hardwood or tile or something that go on a floor, but it could just as easily be, we've seen ads for chocolates and cable companies and, art exhibitions, and they all kind of look the same, especially if you don't speak the language. So Zwart here is rejecting a traditional layout, rejecting symmetry, insisting on strict horizontals and verticals like De Stijl, and synthesizing both the playful vitality of the Dada movement and the strict functionalism and formalism of De Stijl. Here again is another advertisement for the Laga company, the local flooring manufacturer. You can see the De Stijl principles here again. Great with a second color. This is another folder for, what company is this for? See, I can't even tell. I think it's an electric company with this kind of order achieved through repetition. Wonderful use of the little pointing hands there. And this is an ad, obviously, for cable works, not cable as in cable television, but cable as in pieces of wire. So this is 1926. It's funny because it does mention hotspots, but not the kind of hotspots that we're thinking of, more of like hotspots in, transferring heat or electricity or something in the cable. He wrote his own copy there to integrate the idea, again with the headline in English and the rest in German. Dutch. This is a cover from the NKF Cableworks dialogue. I guess this would be, the Cableworks would be something in a combination of our electric company and phone company, so laying the cable that's like electrifying the countryside. And here we have contrast again in the weight and the size of the type. He's progressed beyond his strict horizontal and verticals and gone with a radical diagonal, and this red wedge intersecting a blue halftone in the back, getting more and more interesting. This is some of the interior pages from this Cableworks catalog. An amazing picture of a, telephone interchange, some kind of equipment in the background there, and strips of film. And I challenge anyone here to do a catalog for pieces of wire that is as interesting as this. Go ahead, you try it. Here we have another page from the English language version of the Cableworks catalog, talking about put a NCW cable between you and the risks of breakdown. Look at the guy freaking out. My internet's out. No, my lights have gone out. Ah! Wonderful little business card for P.A. Zwart. Who are we talking to here? Who are we channeling? Thank you, Mr. Malyevich. This is his personal logo from 1927, and it's a little visual verbal pun. Again, his name, Zwart, means black in Dutch, and P.A. is like the letter P. Another experimental letter form, type form guy is H.N. Verkman. He was an experimental artist and printer. He set up a secret print shop during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands and ended up being shot by the Gestapo in 1945 for printing forbidden matter. He was definitely was a communist, and you'll see some indications of that, and a resistor to the Nazis. This is a nice piece that was made again in this experimental printing technique, which I'll show you more about. This piece uses the impression of a lock plate from a door. So he just grabbed a piece of metal from his door, mixed it up with some pieces of metal letterpress type, and it suggests an uppercase E. Here's one of what I was talking about, a pretty much proof. This is maybe the thing that got him shot. I don't know. This is from 1924. It was a page from the magazine Next Call, and it is a work commemorating the death of Lenin. It's called Lenin's Funeral, and you see the columns of O's and M's that represent soldiers guarding Lenin's casket. This was called concrete typography, exploring type as a concrete visual form as well as alphabetic communication. So playing with letters as shapes and pieces of art like heads and bodies, not only words. Here we have a well-known spread again from that magazine, The Call. Here's some visuals from a contemporary workman printing process workshop, and just so that you can see how this was done, it's basically upside down from typical letterpress printing. In standard letterpress printing, the letters would be laid down on the bed of the printing press with their faces facing up where the ink would go. But here, people are inking each letter by hand and then plopping them face down on top of the paper. So it's just flipped. Before the paper, the block would go on the bottom and the paper would go on the top. Here, the paper's on the bottom and the type is on the top, if you know what I'm saying. So what happens is you get to play very free form without any lockups, without any horizontals or verticals, without doing any complex furniture arrangement on the press, and just really play with typefaces as shapes, and also be able to do things like hand-rolled variations in the color, which you can see at the blue and yellow letter form has two different colors, rolled on there together, which is not easy to do when you're working on a press. Love this picture because it shows how you have to get down and dirty with the type. And again, the people are acting as the compositors instead of forming them up in rigid geometrical shapes. Some examples from a contemporary workshop with my friends Lead Graffiti. If any of you remember last semester, we had some collaboration with them. And these, again, are using the workman style freeform composition where things can be all kinds of wonky angles. In this continuing Bauhaus and new typography tradition, we have another artist, William Sandberg, who printed a book called Experimental Typographica in 1956. Much later, you can see this is an illustration of the utility of the word jugs, krugs. So we've got the U is a vessel that's filled with blue letters. The inner life principle. Can you see the word life? He was an explorer, again, when it came to typographic experimentation. Another piece by Sandberg. This is the cover for a magazine called New in 1959. with very funky hand carved or drawn type forms. You can see he enjoyed ripping out letters from pieces of paper. This is another page from that publication, New, in 1959, with large initial caps that are torn from paper, and then very familiar looking Bauhaus arrangement there in sculpture, music, painting, photography, and dance. That's it for the Bauhaus. You'll find it wherever you go. Look around you. It's everywhere in buildings. If you go in downtown in any big city, we'll see the Cubist inspiration of square architectural forms and blocky buildings and exposed glass and concrete. If you look at any web design, you'll see the evolution of the grid, and just about any printed matter, especially if it's got that sans serif type, Bauhaus is in the house. Bye.